Most people who begin healing do not imagine themselves entering an initiatory path. They imagine they are simply ill, overwhelmed, anxious, exhausted, not themselves, or trapped in symptoms they cannot solve. It's just one of those things. They feel destabilized, confused, and feel as though their life is being ripped away from them or been ripped from their hands. But behind this confusion is something deeply coherent. When the nervous system has carried too much for too long, when the emotional body is saturated, when old survival strategies collapse, when the psyche can no longer maintain the old full shape, the deeper self begins a process of reorganization. And this process is not random. It is not madness. It is not spiritual fantasy. And it is not psychological failure or breakdown. It follows a recognizable pattern if you have eyes to see. A sequence of thresholds the human system must cross when it moves from survival to authenticity, from repression to integration, from ego to self, from fragmentation to coherence. And I call these thresholds the 12 gates. Not because they are cosmic realms or mystical portals, but because they are real, somatic, psychological transitions, natural phases of human evolution, awakening, healing, and reorganization. And these gates reveal something essential. Transformation has structure, healing has an architecture, awakening has an arc, and the psyche knows how to walk it. And in this essay, I want to introduce this architecture, explain why this map is so urgently needed. And I want to do a series of essays to really flesh this out so that we have something to understand, a framework within which to place where we are now, that we can trust and understand. This is just nature. And we need a map because people can feel so overwhelmed, not because healing is impossible, but because healing has no signposts. Everyone is floundering around, looking to heal, to get rid of symptoms, but all the time missing what's right underneath them. The nervous system is an ancient system. Its movements are cyclical, instinctual, and deeply, profoundly intelligent. But the conscious mind experiences these movements as chaos when it lacks understanding. And this is why people fear, panic, dissociation, somatic waves, emotional storms, intrusive thoughts, and existential collapse. Not because these experiences are inherently dangerous, but because they apparently appear without explanation. And this is why I want to provide a framework so it can make sense of what you're experiencing. The ego does not fear feeling, it fears not understanding feeling. The body does not fear release, it fears not knowing what release means. And what looks like collapse is so often initiation. What feels like regression is often descent for integration. And what feels like breaking down is often the psyche reorganizing itself at a deeper level if we support and allow it. A map does not remove the difficulty and the unpleasantness of this process, but it does remove the terror and the need to try and control it. When people know where they are, they can relax into this phase. We are meaning-making machines, and we want to understand the landscape within which we exist. They can cooperate with the process rather than resist it, because it is the only way this can unfold. They can recognize the intelligence beneath the profound discomfort. And this clarity creates safety. Safety creates coherence. Coherence is healing. And this is why this system, 12 gates, I'm calling it, popped into my head. This is why this exists. The 12 gates describes the anatomy, effectively, of the deep psychological and transformation of the human being. If we let it, they map how the human system moves through chronic activation, cognitive overdrive, the return to sensation, the upward surge of unprocessed energy, the overload in the head, the awakening of the deeper psyche, the exhaustion of the ascent, and the descent of awareness back into the body, the return of shadow material, the reformation of identity, and the final emergence into a stable, flexible, self-led way of being. These are not mystical stages. They are neurobiological, emotional, somatic, psychological, and archetypal phases. And every gate corresponds to a nervous system state, polyvagal theory, a somatic layer, trauma and embodiment work, a psychological task, Jungian individuation, an energetic movement, Kundalini ascent, descent as physiology, not mysticism, a shadow retrieval process, an ego self-reorganization, and developmental completion of previously unfinished processes. And this system, these gates, give form to something that until now has been experienced as chaos. There is order. And they show us that the human nervous system is just moving from fragmentation to wholeness. We are moving to wholeness and selfhood, as we are teleologically driven to do, like all things in nature, to move and become. So what the 12 gates I'm describing here are not. I just want to go clear the ground before we go further. The 12 gates are not spiritual levels in the obvious sense. They are not metaphysical planes, a hierarchy of consciousness, supernatural realms, religious doctrine, a claim of specialness, a belief system, or something that requires faith or allegiance. They are the map of how the human nervous system, psyche, and emotional body reorganize under the influence of deep healing, as it's driven to do, blueprinted to do in nature, if we allow it. They do not elevate anyone. They do not grant us status. They do not make a person enlightened. They simply reveal what the body psyche has known all along. And yes, they are a step on the path to all of these, but they are not the final destination. So where does this model come from? It did not fall from the sky. It did not come from revelation. It did not arrive as dogma. It emerged naturally from my lived experience of descent, the observation of emotional integration, somatic awareness, and everything I've studied around this, trauma healing, decades of Jungian psychological mapping, all which is showing this, the physiology of Kundalini processes understood in a non-mystical way, polyvagal insights into autonomic states, thousands of case patterns across human history, the archetypal symbolic structure the psyche reveals under pressure, the collapse and reconstruction of ego identity, and the nervous system's innate intelligence during deep change. It is not invention, it is synthesis of all these understandings. It is a remembering of what this framework is, an articulation of a pattern of the human system that has been expressing since time immemorial and being recorded for thousands of years. You can find the echoes in individuation, shamanic initiation, Sufi stations, Zen unfolding, trauma integration cycles, initiation rites, alchemical stages, myth, depth psychology, and somatic completion. But this framework here I'm doing is to just reassure you that there is one understanding that everyone is pointing to and put it into a single, clear, accessible, somatic, usable map. And this is what should resonate. This should click, and it describes what people are already experiencing in their millions. Most people struggle not because their symptoms are wrong, but because the framework they use to interpret them is inadequate. People think I'm regressing, I'm losing control, I'm breaking down, this can't be healing, my mind is going, And in reality, they are moving from gate 3 to 4, transitioning from gate 7 to 8, hitting the saturation of gate 6, descending into gate 9, and integrating into gate 10, reforming identity in gate 11. And I will be going in these videos through each gate, and you will recognize where you are on this journey. Because without a map, the system interprets its own growth and development as threat. And this is why this system matters. It keeps the ego from panicking, so the body can complete what it has been trying to complete forever. The map does not accelerate healing. The map removes resistance to it. And without resistance, nature will just do her work. People often assume that maps arise from the end of a process, but they rarely do. And more likely they emerge at the midpoint of the journey. In every major tradition, Jung, Zen, somatic experiencing, Kundalini, shamanic rites, existential therapy, and trauma integration, it is midway through the descent, coming back to ourselves, that meaning-making begins. Not at the end, not at the beginning. It is the moment the ego softens enough and the unconscious rises enough and the nervous system stabilizes enough for the architecture to be revealed. And this is why these 12 gates appear as they do. Not because someone is now finished and they can look back and see it all, but because they are finally clear enough to see pattern and structure. And most of you out there, as you're doing this work, will start to be noticing these patterns, these schemas that are happening, on, off, integration, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, how things seem to appear in cycles, in rhythms, as we know, of course, they do. This is the natural timing of the psyche. So how do we use this model? This 12-gate system I'm designing to describe something that just is, by the way. Don't give me any credit. It's just nature. I'm just explaining it. Are meant to help people find themselves, understand their symptoms as what they truly are, stop fearing normal phases of healing, as unpleasant as they are, and recognize the intelligence of the body, the wisdom of nature, to reduce shame and confusion, and identify what is completing if necessary, to allow what needs to be allowed, to release control, to surrender egoic management, and orient themselves to the next step, and to completely regain trust in nature. This model gives people a language for the panic they felt, the collapse they couldn't escape, the fear they thought was regression, the rising energy that seemed so terrifying, the head symptoms they misunderstood, the emotional storms they resisted, the identity shifts they feared, the descent they didn't choose, the shadow we couldn't face, the clarity that pleasantly surprises us, and the new identity growing in silence beneath all of this. And when people understand these phases, they finally feel safe enough to let healing happen. So, this is just the opening essay, and the rest of this series will deal with a map of each gate in detail and explain the somatic, psychological and emotional processes at each stage, show how the gates correspond to Jung trauma theory, Kundalini, somatic experiencing, Zen and polyvagal science, provide practical tools for each gate, reveal the deeper architecture of the path, give people the language and direction they've been missing, and bring the descent out of silence and into understanding, to understand that the process is natural, and help us to navigate our own transformation, and to give the world a grounded, humane model for awakening and healing. So, when people understand where they are, they stop resisting where they need to go. So keep watching, and it will explain and reassure you that everything is exactly as it should be, and then we need to allow it. Let's look at the science behind the 12 gates: trauma, polyvagal theory, Jungian individuation and somatic awakening. Because the 12 gates is not just a metaphysical system, it's not an esoteric cosmology, it's not a description of higher planes in the sense you think, or supernatural realms. It describes in precise psychological and physiological terms the sequence of changes that appear when the nervous system reaches long-held survival energy, the psyche integrates the unconscious and shadow layers, and the emotional body completes its backlog. The sense of self reorganizes around deeper awareness. And these processes are scientifically grounded, clinically recognised and cross-culturally documented. And this is why I want to draw together this universal framework so we can understand that what's happening to us is safe, is fine, is a blueprint for nature and our evolution as human beings, for healing and development of our own consciousness. So I'm drawing here from 6 core disciplines. So we've got Jungian individuation, depth psychology, trauma and somatic integration, SE, neurobiology, affective neuroscience, polyvagal theory, Kundalini physiology, understood in a non-mystical, practical way, developmental neuroscience and ego psychology, and comparative mysticism and archetypal initiation cycles. And this map, these gates, is what emerges when these fields are all integrated into one coherent map. And I want to explain how I've integrated these here. So let's just start with polyvagal theory, the nervous system cycles of activation and release. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory describes the three primary autonomic states: ventral vagal, safety, connection, presence; sympathetic, fight, flight, mobilization; and dorsal vagal, freeze, shut down or collapse. Healing is not a straight line from sympathetic activation to ventral calm. It moves in cycles: activation, discharge, collapse, restoration, re-engagement. You'll feel it, you'll know it as you have release, integration, pause, integrate, transcend. All of these processes as waves, as cycles, as spirals in a rhythm. And these cycles are the physiological underpinning of this 12-gate map. For example, gate 1 map to, let's go from long-term sympathetic strain, to be stuck in prolonged fight or flight, into now dorsal collapse. Gate 3 provides the map to the cognitive hypervigilance. This is where we're sympathetic, very, very busy in the head, very, very activated. Gate 4 maps the return to ventral vagal presence, through sensation. Gates 5 to 7 map to sympathetic mobilized charge rising. 8 maps to dorsal shutdown. This is energetic depletion and exhaustion. 9 to 10 maps the ventral re-entry and sympathetic discharge through the tissues. And gates 11 to 12 map to stabilize ventral flexibility. Now, you don't have to remember all of that. You don't have to even understand it. Suffice to say, there is a coherent map that explains these different stages. So the gates describe the exact order in which the nervous system basically becomes overwhelmed, becomes disorganized, releases what it's holding, and restores mobility again, and then returns to regulation. This is not spiritual, it is neurophysiology. And it's happening if we allow it. So the next aspect to understand this is from a trauma research and somatic integration point of view. Bessel van der Kolk looking at implicit body memory, Peter Levine somatic experiencing, incomplete survival responses held in the body, Pat Ogden sensory motor psychotherapy, Stephen Porges' polyvagal neuroception, Jaak Panksepp affective circuits, and Candice Pert emotions as molecules and somatic stores. Trauma is not stored in the mind. I think everyone accepts that now. It is stored in the tissues, in autonomic patterns, in muscular contractions, in interoceptive blind spots, in incomplete instinctive movements, and in suppressed emotional arcs. And the 12-gate describes step by step how stored emotional charge moves from freeze to mobilization, from dissociation to sensation, unconscious becoming conscious, from implicit memory to present experience, from contraction to release, from coming into awareness, from these deep shadow, unconscious states into awareness, and from the body to integration. For example, gate 4 is the moment people first start noticing the body again, from having lived in their heads. Gate 5 is the rising, therefore, because we've returned to the body, of this trapped mobilizing energy now being permitted to move. Gate 6 and 7 are the struggle between expression and suppression, because it will feel very hard. And this is obviously what people are dealing with a lot now, if they're here listening. And gates 9 and 10 are the deep release cycles and shadow return, as the ego respects our return to the body, as those parts that have been exiled are now allowed back, if we're talking in those terms. But basically it's signaling by safety, us being in the body, that it is now okay to discharge that which has been held, waiting, traumatic memory, as real biological events in the body and in the nervous system. And this is the same sequence Peter Levine observed in animals, but in humans it becomes psychological, symbolic and existential. The gates do not contradict trauma science. They extend it into a complete developmental arc. Now Jung, let's look at individuation and the return of the shadow. Jung spent his entire career mapping how the psyche protects itself, fragments, represses, splits, compensates, collapses, and reintegrates, and finally becomes whole. And these 12 gates mirror, as with these preceding positions, precisely these steps. So the early gates, the ego is strained to breaking point, symptoms start arising, shadow material starts to stir, and the unconscious presses upwards. In the middle gates, 5 to 8, the ascent of energy corresponds to inflation, psychic activation, archetypal emergence, ego destabilization, temporary higher states when we can be in the self, when we can be beyond the experience, we can see our patterns, our habits, the version we were, and we are beginning to no longer identify with that, and confrontation with the self, followed by collapse and exhaustion as the work needs to get done. And then later, 9 to 12, this is individuation proper starts. This is where we descend back into the body, meeting the shadow direction, integrating split off parts, reforming, reformulating the identity, recalibrating and reorganizing around the ascendancy and autonomy of the self as the center of consciousness. Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." It is not a metaphor. It is psychophysiology. And the gates offer the structure Jung described, but in a clear, accessible, trauma-aware, somaticized form. Now let's look at Kundalini physiology, and let's leave to one side for the moment the mystical, spiritual aspects of it, because I want to really focus on how it manifests through the body. Because traditional Kundalini literature describes rising activation, head pressure, intuitive expansion, psychic openings, saturation as we descend back into the body, descent, embodiment, and then ultimately stabilization. These are not supernatural phenomena, they are supernatural phenomena. This is nature in its greatest, most fundamental form, and they correspond to sympathetic activation, rising through the central channel, cranial nerve saturation, sensory amplification, interoceptive flooding, neurochemical imbalances, cortical overload, vagal discharge, and somatic integration. And the 12 gates here are often offering a non-mystical explanation for what the Kundalini processes have symbolically oppressed for centuries. Of course, there is a greater meaning to it, but here we're looking at how it affects the neurophysiology, how it affects the psyche, how it affects and is mapped in every single one of these observations, and drawing together a coherent, unified map to express what we will be going through. And every gate mirrors a stage described in traditional Kundalini text, but with trauma-informed, nervous system grounded clarity. Developmental neuroscience and ego psychology. The gate also maps onto developmental shifts in default mode network activity, prefrontal cortex regulation, limbic responsivity, interoceptive accuracy, emotional granularity, narrative identity, and ego strengthening and ego softening cycles. For example, gate 3, as we move up through this process, the default mode network is in overdrive. overthinking, rumination, looping thoughts, OCD. Gate 7 is reduced ego boundaries. 8 to 9, the default mode network starts to collapse and reconfigure. 10 to 11 is the re-establishing of stable selfhood. And 12 is the full integration of top-down and bottom-up processing, the reconnection, the reconsolidating of coherence within the system. And this is the neuroscience of identity transformation. And the 12 gates offers the felt version of this developmental restructuring. Now let's go to the archetypal initiation and cross-cultural parallels here, because anthropology, mythology, and comparative mysticism reveal nearly all identical phases. The call, the crisis, the descent, the ordeal, the death of the old identity, the recovery, the return, and the reintegration back into the community. And the gates align perfectly with the hero's journey, not because the model is derivative, but because the psyche expresses it universally. And humans transform in predictable patterns because the psyche is structured. And the 12 gates are now my attempting to provide a contemporary articulation of a deeply ancient sequencing. So let's put it all together. What is it actually describing, this 12 gates cartography, this mapping? Well, when we integrate all these fields, a cohesive picture emerges. The 12 gates map how the nervous system, the emotional body, and the psyche reorganize during deep healing and the process of human consciousness, awakening, and evolution. They show activation, destabilization, mobilization, emotional resurfacing, shadow return, identity dissolution, descent, integration, reformation, embodiment, and the return to life. This is not just a mystical journey. It is a biological, physiological, emotional, and archetypal one. And the gates simply articulate this structure. So why does this matter? It can give people, like any map, orientation, meaning, stability, explanation, compassion for what they're experiencing and where they are, a sense of progress, a path, a way to understand their symptoms, a framework to reduce fear, and a language to speak about the process of healing and awakening without metaphysics that can seem so alien to our modern culture. And most importantly, they give people permission to trust what is happening, because healing becomes bearable when it becomes comprehensible. Transformation becomes safe when it becomes mapped. We can cope with it if we understand the why, and descent becomes meaningful when it is known. So where do we go next? In subsequent essays here, I'm going to do a whole series, gate by gate exploration, what each gate feels like, what's happening physiologically, psychologically, shadow material returning, what shifts in identity occur, how to navigate each state, and to know when you are transitioning, what each gate will feel like, what to avoid in each stage, what supports this process at each level. And I want to make here a manual that just maps this natural human transformation, grounded, precise, and compassionate. So continuing this series on the 12 gates of transformation, I want to explain why the psyche does not transform all at once, why healing happens in waves, why the nervous system only releases one layer at a time, and why shadow and emotional content return sequentially, why identity dissolves and reforms in stages, and why people cannot skip phases. There's no bypassing, and why descent always follows ascent, why the self only reveals what the ego can tolerate, and why deep layers emerge only when safety is present. And please, if you think you don't feel safe, look at the other videos and explain. Allowing equals safety. Schedule equals safety. And this is crucial to understand because it prevents people from seeing this as a purely abstract concept or arbitrary. It's anchoring people in what is effectively a natural principle, a teleological drive towards wholeness and healing. And I want to show that these 12 stages are inevitable rather than invented. They are archetypal. It also explains the body's pacing, intelligence and timing, and normalizes the fact that deeper material arrives only later, which is why we feel worse as we're getting closer. It's the stuff at the bottom of the barrel. It helps people trust their own process and protects them from self-judgment and self-sabotage. And I'm talking small self-sabotage. So if the last essay gave the science, I want this one to give the logic. Most people imagine transformation as something fluid, continuous, linear. A gentle upward slope, a gradual softening, a slow return to calm, bit by bit, slow return to self, an unfurling that feels like obvious progress. This is not how nature or human beings actually change. Real transformation, emotional, somatic, psychological and spiritual, does not happen gently or all at once. It does not arrive in a single insight, a single release, or a single awakening. It does not arrive because someone understands enough or tries hard enough. It arrives in thresholds. It arrives in phases, and it arrives in distinct states of reorganization, each one opening a gate the previous one could not access. It's not symbolic, it's not mystical, it's biological, neurological, somatic, archetypal, and universal. There are so many ways to describe this framework, this architecture, and I want to explore why the human system transforms in these gates, and why these 12 gates identified are the most complete articulation of this natural sequence. And understanding why change is gated is essential for trusting the process. Without this understanding, you will misinterpret transformation as instability, failure, regression, or chaos. But when you see the necessity, the incredible intelligence and inevitability of these thresholds, everything will change. Your resistance will reduce and you will surrender to this process. The nervous system can only release one layer at a time of that which has been holding. You probably understood now that your nervous system dysregulated as a symptom of emotional repression and blocked life force energy because we have not been able to feel what we naturally wanted to feel as human beings in flow due to history, due to culture. So it's now held in the body, held in the nervous system, waiting for space to be able to discharge what it's holding. The autonomic nervous system is ancient. It governs safety, mobilization, shutdown, dissociation, emotional expression, instinct, and survival. You cannot choose to heal. The nervous system does not work that way for you. It works at its own pace according to its own thresholds. A system that has been strained for years or decades will not release everything at once. And people who try and do so with some of these silly ego-led exercises to force release or delving into plant medicine without container or stability will find that it's very dangerous. The body releases in sequential layers, sympathetic to dorsal, dorsal to sympathetic, sympathetic to ventral, ventral to collapse, and collapse to partial immobilization, mobilization to discharge, discharge to integration. Each shift requires a threshold crossing, and this is why the 12 gates emerges. Each gate represents a neurophysiological capacity that must activate before the next can occur. For example, you cannot descend, gate 9, going back into the body to now allow what's there to be felt, until the system has exhausted the ascent, which is gate 8. You cannot retrieve the shadow, gate 9, gate 10, until the unconscious becomes safe. You cannot reform identity, gate 11, until the emotional backlog is resolved. That's shadow, clearing from the past. And you cannot reach regulation, gate 12, until the body regains mobility, gate 11. So it's all sequence. You don't have to remember any of this. You just have to know that there is a framework. And healing is gated because the nervous system is designed to protect you. It reveals only what you can metabolize in the moment, and it only opens the doors you are able and ready to walk through, and of course, what the ego can cope with. Because the emotional body releases in arcs, not floods. Emotion is not psychological content, it is biological movement. And every emotional arc is a rise, a peak, an expression, a dissipation, and a resolution. A full arc. When emotions are suppressed or interrupted, the arc cannot complete, and the body holds the unexpressed energy in storage. And over years, the storage becomes chronic tension, somatic pain, anxiety, fatigue, inflammation, sensory overload, dissociation, shutdown. And when the emotional body begins to release, either because we're starting to allow the symptoms as they present in the body up this somatic ladder, or because it literally has just been forced upon us because the storage cannot take anymore, the body is so full, it won't empty everything at once because it would just blow your head off. It would completely send you over the edge. Instead, it releases one arc at a time. And this is why gate 4 is a return to sensation, is to recognize and allow sensation. Gate 5 is the rising of the emotional charge. Gate 7 is the confrontation with the unprocessed content. Gate 9 is the descent into the deep emotional strata, and gate 10 is the release of deeper arcs. Again, you don't have to understand and remember each one. You just have to understand there is a well-observed pattern to this. And each gate, each stage, corresponds to a layer of emotional backlog coming into consciousness, finally, after having been repressed for years and years. So the 12 gates maps these arcs in order from the shallow layers to the deepest one. This is not mystical, it is neuro-emotional sequencing. Jung saw this clearly. The unconscious does not come forward all at once. The shadow, which includes exiled emotions, disowned traits, suppressed impulses, forgotten truths, unmet needs, lost instinct, buried trauma, rejected identities, returns in waves, not floods. This is because the ego, as I alluded to earlier, has a tolerance capacity. If too much shadow rises before the ego is ready, the psyche destabilizes. People can end up getting mentally unwell, having endless looping anxiety, even becoming psychotic. And this is what happens if people try and force releases from the ego. And there are plenty of modalities out there. Joe Dispenza does it a lot. Please avoid that. I have seen so many casualties of that. Trying to release something from consciousness, we have to create space and allow from consciousness for it to naturally come to us. And the same with deep aggressive breath work or trying to chase emotional releases. That can be very dangerous, and it just means you're cycling round and round and round with the energy that's been released not able to integrate into the whole and just get sent back round and round again on a carousel until we develop enough ability to allow it to integrate, train the ego to allow what's coming into consciousness. So please, nature's got it. You don't have to make this happen. You do have to learn to allow it to happen though. So the psyche regulates shadow in discrete phases, exactly the form we're describing here in these 12 gates. Early on, in the early years of this process of getting ill, which of course is the beginning of healing when you start to have symptoms, shadow only appear as symptoms in the body, and the psyche defends, the ego stiffens, and avoidance reigns. As we move up in the middle gates, shadow starts to become symbolic. Emotional content will rise, we start to feel emotions again, dreams will intensify, and internal conflict surfaces. And later, in this process, the shadow will become embodied, accepted, tolerated, integrated, re-owned, and reclaimed. This requires thresholds. It requires preparation, discipline, and learning to allow it, training the ego to be an allower in service to the self that is guiding this whole process. Shadow does not return until the system has crossed the earlier gates that create emotional resilience, even if you feel completely destabilized emotionally. If you can learn to allow, that is enough of a signal. Somatic safety, a learning to be embodied with what is coming into consciousness. And this will soften the ego. Having interoceptive awareness, becoming again associated and aware of what is happening inside your body and being able to stay there, coming out of the head back to the body, and perceptual clarity. The model is gated because the psyche has exquisite timing. Identity dissolves and reforms similarly in predictable phases. This is about coming back to ourselves. This is the dissolution of the false coping persona, the person we had to become because of society, because of environment, because of necessity. And this is the process of coming back to ourselves, to our own true, authentic identity. And identity is not a fixed thing. It's looping, self-organizing psychological pattern. When life changes you deeply enough, the old identity will naturally dissolve. The organizing principles will shift. The whole center, the whole sort of point of reference of who I am will change. And that sense of I breaks down. The old narratives collapse. A new meaning emerges. A deeper identity forms, more in line with the self, not who the ego thought I is. This does not happen instantly. It does not happen because you want it to happen or you have to make it happen. Discover who I am. Identity reform is stepwise and it's not fluid. There must be disruption, instability, disorientation, emptiness, reintegration, emergence, and then stabilization. This is a very chaotic process. It is the dissolution and reformation of who you are. And it will feel annihilating. It will feel particularly annihilating to the ego. But if you hold and trust, as one door closes, another door will open. And these phases correspond to gate 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. These gates are identity thresholds, psychological reorganizations that cannot be skipped or compressed. You can't avoid them, you can't medicate them away, you can't go around them. They are non-negotiable, mandatory. The psyche cannot become the new self until the old one has dissolved internally. And this is why awakening to ourself feels like dying before it feels like returning. And the gates honour the sequence. And even though it feels like dying, it is completely safe. Every tradition describes this truth. Ascent must precede descent. What rises must descend. Not spiritually, but physiologically. Because the human system cannot descend into the body to integrate until it has first activated what has been repressed and hidden in the shadow. So I've got a dog doing something. So this ascent mobilizes this trapped energy and survival force. Everything from the shadow, this shadow material, it amplifies tension because the ego will resist what it placed out of sight, thinking it's dangerous now, but of course it was, and it's confronting itself coming back, so to speak. It will increase pressure, it will move energy up naturally. It destabilizes the head, it heightens intuition and loosens the ego's grip. It saturates the cognitive system, which is why you'll have so many of these head symptoms: fog, disorientation, dissociation, feeling offline. And once this peak is reached, the upward arc, the ascent, the system, of course, it's reached the top. It can no longer continue upwards. It must invert. And this inversion is gate 8, gate 9, peak collapse, overload descent, symbolic mind to embodied mind, from the crown to the root, doing in reverse what it did. And this insight becomes integration. This is not just mystical Kundalini doctrine. It is the basic pressure dynamics in the nervous system, which, of course, Kundalini beautifully mapped many, many thousands of years ago. So these gates reflect the rise and fall, the up and down, the movement that allows the body to digest and update its own history. The self reveals itself progressively and not all at once, as I said, and the deeper intelligence within each human, the self, does not flood the ego with truth. It does it gently. It emerges slowly, layer by layer, bit by bit, by releasing and integrating action, non-action. The self will start to appear as deep knowing, intuition, clarity, symbolic insight, just moments, glimmers of sort of intense, instinctual knowing, body knowing, emotional honesty, spaciousness, and a sense of coherence with our environment internally and externally. But this emergence comes and is dependent upon safety, doing this work, ego softening, nervous system readiness, shadow integration, somatic release, perceptual stability. The self does not come online until the system is prepared. It knows how and when to organise this. And this is why Gate 7 is the first encounter. Gate 9 is the descent into embodied knowing. Gate 10 is shadow reconciliation. Gate 11 is the self reorganising its identity, updating it more in line with who we truly are. And Gate 12 is the self firmly back in place as the centre of consciousness, leading function. This is the progression, these series of gates. You don't have to remember those. I'm going to do separate essays on each gate. All you have to know, it's already set up to do that. So even though you're feeling like hell, even though you feel like you're dissolving, even though it's all sequenced, it's not comfortable, nature knows what to do. It's a progression. And the self emerges developmentally, not instantly. And it does so in cycles, not straight lines. Every natural process, everywhere in nature you look, follows tension, release, whether it's the weather, whether it's plants, whether it's anything. Growth, breakdown, energy, matter, energy becoming matter, energy. It's this constant transforming and changing. Creation, destruction, creation, contraction, expansion, contraction. All of these constantly cycling. Day, night, back, front. And human transformation is no different. And the 12 gates reflect the biologic of nature. Pressure, saturate, break, fall, sink, reorganize, rise, and stabilize. And human beings change in the same way ecosystems do, the same way cells do, the same way forests do after fire. Thresholds, cycles, gates, death, renewal, old, new, all of that. And nothing transforms continuously. Everything transforms through punctuated shifts, and the gates describe and outline these punctuations. Because without these gates, these gating mechanisms, they're sort of like staging posts, transformation would destroy us. It would overwhelm us. Because if healing came all at once, the nervous system would overload, the ego would collapse, the emotional body would flood, the shadow would completely overwhelm us, and the person would fragment. Gates are protection. And they sequence the process so that you only metabolize what you can. You experience some, it metabolizes, integrates, void state, round again. Bite after bite, in layers, in rhythms, in waves, as per your capacity. And this means your identity, the old identity, the false identity, can dissolve safely. Emotional content releases in manageable arcs. The backload is slowly updated. And the nervous system moves in tolerable, even though it's unpleasant. It might feel intolerable. It's tolerable. It's safe if you do it this way. Don't ever force it. Allow what's there, and you will never go wrong. And the self emerges without, therefore, destabilizing the whole system, naturally. And gates are the nature's way of pacing transformation, and you'll feel it in the body. On, off, holding, bracing, going from activation to freeze, to activation for freeze. It knows exactly how to move this energy around, from shallow breath to deep breath. It's all there. So the gates are not hurdles, they're safeguards. And this is why trying to skip ahead always backfires. And the psyche opens each room only when the person can survive and benefit from what is inside, and when they are ready for what is inside. So in conclusion, the architecture of transformation is highly exquisitely intelligent, but beyond our ability to try and control it. It is not chaotic, not in the least. And the 12 gate models does not impose structure on healing. It reveals the structure that is already there, if we have eyes to see. Why? Because the nervous system moves in cycles, because the emotional body moves in arcs, because the shadow returns in layers, because identity reforms in stages, because ascent must precede descent, and because the self emerges gradually, because nature transforms through thresholds. And transformation arrives in gates because this is the only safe, coherent, biologically possible way for a human to become whole. And understanding this lets people relax into the process, however chaotic, destabilizing, and incredibly unpleasant it feels. It softens fear, it reduces resistance, it brings meaning to what once felt like annihilation or madness. And it prepares individuals for what is coming next, the deep, gate by gate descent into the architecture of themselves.